Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 3 of the Art of Move podcast. My name is Anthony Manuel, and I'm going to be joined by Dr. William Raybar, chiropractor who's working out of Banff, Alberta. And our podcast here is trying to sort of create a grand unified theory of the way the human body is supposed to move, how to move the way our bodies were naturally biologically designed to move, and what makes the most kinesthetic sense, what's going to provide the most longevity, and basically provide the biggest benefits as you're living your life. And so the Art of Move is this podcast where we're talking about some pretty nuanced and detailed things. Will kind of knows more what he's talking about than I do, and my job, my hope is that I'm able to sort of slow down and clarify things from a layman's perspective, because large in part I'm a layman. So Will, I mean, you went to school for chiropractics and have a bit more of a formal background, whereas I might have worked as a personal trainer, but I mean, I took a weekend certification and then just tried to do my own studying from there, right? So we're kind of coming from different educational backgrounds, but the conversation usually flows really well.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't say that you're a layman at all. I mean, you've spent thousands of hours looking into different systems. To be honest, most physios, chiropractors, and I'm assuming sports med guys, they go through the formal education process, but you don't really learn the nuances of, the fitness world, the exercise world, biomechanics. You're not getting deep into that the way that people are doing now with slow motion video. It just isn't something that's emphasized. There is extracurriculars, and a lot of people do go into those, especially in chiro. People were really interested in, at that time it would have been Gray Cook's functional movement assessment, or what's happening in the squat and how that breaks down into how you look at the body. Okay, but that's pretty much as far as it went at that point, and that was about 10 years ago.
And so, one thing too, for any listener to kind of, if you're just jumping in on episode 3 and you missed episode 1 and 2, we're not necessarily working on the same models that a lot of academics or a lot of maybe formally trained physiotherapists would even be working on. And we kind of explain why we're not working on those same models. It's a different map, so to speak. So we're focusing, one of the ways that we defined functional fitness on the very first episode was, rather than having an emphasis on strength and growing the muscle, we have an emphasis on joint longevity. And, we even go against the mainstream physiotherapist approach of joint longevity, which focuses on the stability of the joint. We kind of focus on how is the body meant to move. And if it's meant to move that way, if it was designed, evolved over millions of years to move a particular way, then it should be safe, because nature's design is pretty much damn close to perfect, right? That's the perspective that, when I've been, gathering from these conversations, and correct me if I'm wrong, man, that's the vibe that I've been getting.
Well, yeah, I think you're completely correct. When you said, joint mobility, there's also joint stability, right? Mm-hmm. So therapists are very concerned with joint mobility and stability. Okay, two sides of the coin. They don't mean the exact same thing, and that's not exactly what I want to get into right now. But there's something called the joint by joint approach, and most physios, chiros, sports med people prescribe to this. And again, I think we went over it a little bit last time. It goes in your body from the foot. It's mobility, stability, mobility, stability, going up the body, right? So every joint you have, knee, hip, lower.
So it'd be like a mobile ankle, stable knee, mobile hip, stable lumbar, all the way up the chain, essentially.
Exactly. And that's called the joint by joint theory. It's that if you, let's say in the hip, it's supposed to be mobile, right? So if it is not mobile, then you're going to have problems above and below the joint. So right. In therapy, we always learn, don't look at the actual area of pain, look above or below the joint. And that made a lot of sense, right? So that's kind of in line with the joint by joint theory. But now with, looking at the body a little bit differently, I'd say there is a code within nature, and that you have to be within that code. Those are joint angles, and angles that are very particular to phases of the walk, of the gait.
Right.
Like when your foot lands on the ground, your body should look like this versus the joint by joint approach that says what's happening at each joint. Is it mobile? Is it stable? Right? So they're coming off completely different models. So it may be hard for an academic to grasp the concepts when it's been in the other camp for so long. Mobility and stability versus being in position.
And you could even say that the joint by joint approach, because we did try to do a joint by joint approach in describing this model where we said, okay, well, while you're in these positions, what are the universal happenings in each joint? For example, in the ankle, we talked about having the inside ankle bone high, one of the principles that the GOTA locomotive systems teaches. You can do a joint by joint approach. I think it's a way of looking at the information and not necessarily but the issue about just looking at the information is they're skipping the step of defining the patterns. And so what we've been trying to do, I have an ambition to kind of like distill some of Will's information and share it with you. So in my head, I was operating on the old model. I was like, Will, why don't we start from the foot and go all the way up the chain? But unfortunately, because I wanted to give people a foundational, like, how do you train each joint? How do, if we're focusing, if the foundation of functional fitness is a joints first approach, then in my mind, it made sense to go through each joint. However, that's not the first focus. The first focus is the definition and the understanding of the movement patterns themselves, so that if you do want to break it down to the individual constituents, because we went through the gait starting from the foot. So what we covered last episode was you start on the outside edge of your foot and you pivot inwards towards your big toe, not actually stepping on your big toe, but that bony sort of boomerang shaped arch on the outside edge of your foot. That's the pivot point for when you step forward. It's not your heels. You don't collapse in on your arch at all. That's the outside bony edge and it pivots in. We also defined that the ankle bone, so moving from the foot to the ankle, the inside ankle bone has to stay high. And that's just a natural result of the other parts of your body, like your foot, like your knee, like your hip, being in the proper place as well. So one of the things that was like, where I realized that this whole joint by joint approach didn't work was when we're going through it, it's like, well, your inside ankle bone stays high. You don't really do an isolated ankle exercise. I guess you could, but like you want to be in these movement patterns. And if your leg naturally bows, then your inside ankle bone lifts anyway. If you're turning your hips the right way, then your knee does the bow. And it's not just, okay, you can't break it down into the joint components because it's the entirety of the pattern. It's the entirety of the movement that creates the effect that you're looking for.
And you have it right. I think it goes in order of priority, right? If I'm looking at it, I'm not going to look at the joints first in isolation. I'm going to look at, are you within the math? Are your joint angles, the way you're landing with your whole body, does it hit the checklist? Is your head over your foot? Are you landing on the outside edge of your foot? Is your butt behind your rib cage? I look at these things first before I go joint by joint, but there's nothing wrong with focusing in on a joint if that's your particular issue. Okay, so I've assessed people that I see, their ankles in particular, their hips are good, they're forward, they're landing head over foot, but in particular, their ankles are weak, let's say from a sprain or strain. In that case, I'm going to focus on the ankle, right?
Right.
But it really does come down to personal history there. It does help. But in general, if I'm not seeing the person, I want them to be in good positioning first with the whole body, hitting those checklists that I mentioned before, last episode. The foot landing on the outside edge, ankle bones high, knee pointing in the same direction as the torso outside. So that would be, approximately 20 degrees towards the outside. Okay. We're having our hips back in a hip dominant, back chain dominant position, and your head is over your foot. Your spine is slightly bent. Okay, so if you hit those points, then I'm going to want that before I look at the particular joints. However, I may do that as well.
Because the joints won't make sense outside of the context of those mechanics, right? You can't look at each of them in isolation necessarily. You have to kind of understand. You have to understand the whole chain before you break it down into its links, essentially.
Well, for instance, if someone's front chain, If your hips are way forward, your hips are here, and your spine is back like this, and you're moving forwards in the forwards direction, okay, you're going to have a whole host of problems that won't be able to be fixed unless you address that first, okay?
Right.
So why not take the low-hanging fruit down, okay? Those points I mentioned before, and then we can start hyper-focusing on joints if you want, if that's your issue, right? But it doesn't happen joint by joint and just like mobile, stable, mobile, stable. Actually, what we went through was talking joint by joint, okay? The nuances of the joint, but it wasn't the joint by joint approach theory, which says mobile, stable, mobile, stable, mobile, stable. We're going way deeper than that.
So this is, the idea that your spine should stay stable, for example, because your spine is part of the segments that is broken up in the joint by joint approach, because your spine is a series of joints, essentially, right? So there's this idea of stable cores and stable spines. And one of the things that we alluded to in the last episode as well, as we were going, like through each joint, was the term spinal engine. And I mean, I've only heard the term spinal engine recently because you brought it up to me this year. And it changed the way that I looked at the spine. The spinal engine, can you give a brief definition of what it would be for newcomers to it? Like if I was like I was just maybe a month ago, well, how would you, like, what is the spinal engine in a nutshell?
Okay, so the spinal engine is the fact that your spine bends during motion. So if I'm walking and I let my body relax, I'm going to naturally have a little bit of a sway back and forth. Okay?
Right.
Modern training, modern theory says that you should actually keep your spine really rigid and still. Okay, and that's the brace the core model that says that basically the spine is a passive column. It's going along for the ride, and your legs are doing the work. The spinal engine says, no, no, no. The spine is what's driving the movement. It's actually more like an engine waving back and forth, and your legs are just going along for the ride. So they're literally opposed to each other.
Right.
Okay, so the reason I think spinal engine is correct is if you walk slowly enough, you're going to go head over foot. Your spine's going to bend somewhat. Okay, you can't really help this. You can train yourself out of it by doing stability, too much stability training. Okay, too much global stability where your rib cage is really tense. Okay, and we're actually doing this with lifting and a lot of different activities. It's everywhere. Okay, 99.9% of training at this point is stability training. You're training the spinal engine out of yourself. You're training the side-to-side motion of your spine out of your natural ability, which is really what happens when you crawl. You're doing it from a young age. You can't crawl without a bendy spine. Okay, for some, when you start to walk as a child, that sway is still there. At some point, we lose it. Whether it's being in school for 20 years, just sitting, okay, being completely still, exercise, which says keep it rigid, keep your core rigid. We're training this out of ourselves. And I'm saying we need to start training this back into ourselves, especially athletes and regular lay people too, because it keeps you healthy. Okay. Having those motions from side to side is what you naturally should do in my mind. This is my argument. And the rotations of your spine go along with those side to side motions. If you don't allow the rotations of your spine to happen, you're going to get rotations elsewhere, places where you don't want them to be. That's kind of like the joint by joint theory from that I mentioned before, except that in the joint by joint theory, they don't even acknowledge spinal engine really. Maybe now they might be saying a little bit about it. I've heard of someone saying core pendulum theory, Charlie Weingroff, and he brings it into a stability context. But having the spine wave back and forth is not stability in itself. It is allowing your body to do it and training it back into yourself.
And so, because again, like my context of learning about the spine was to not move it. Essentially, I power lifted, I did CrossFit, and the more stable your core was, the less likely it was to crumble under the weight and the force of a barbell resting on it. And that made sense because, like, frankly, if you're trying to withstand the force of 400 pounds on your back in a back squat, then like you do want to brace your core lest you, like I said, crumble underneath that weight. However, if you're thinking about an evolutionary context, it's very, very rare that you would ever see a human being have that much axial loading on his spine.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying there's not really a biological basis for squatting 400 pounds.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Like, let's say throughout evolution, I think it's a consensus now that would say that, humans are evolved to walk and run. Maybe it's not. I think it is, right? Walking and running is priority, okay, or one of the major priorities. Now, let's say you went for a kill. You just, went for a hunt. You ran 10 miles or whatever. You now have a, dead animal that you need to bring back. It's still a locomotion system. You're still carrying it back and going back to locomotion. You're not just squatting the animal down 100 times for fun.
No.
Pushing the animal down and high-fiving your boys, right? It's not happening like that. It's you need to get the animal back to your tribe, right? Or whatever, your fruits, vegetables, whatever you gathered, you need to walk it back.
It's forward locomotion without a uniform load, essentially.
Yes, yeah, all the time. Even in the context of us lifting in the past, it would be in the context of lifting an object to get it somewhere.
Yeah, we wouldn't just be lifting rocks for the sake of lifting rocks. At least not while we were evolving.
Yeah, either way, the way you lift, okay, you do brace. The heavier you lift, and the more let's just say the heavier you lift, the more you do have to brace your core. We know this from, the lifting world. The best lifters in the world, the people who can lift the most weight, have to brace their core to the max. The heavier you lift, the more you brace. But does that mean that you brace during forward locomotion or during like a swing or along those lines where it's not heavy lifting? I disagree. You don't brace. And training it into ourselves constantly to be braced, to be stable, does not provide the right movement of your spine for forward locomotion. And that's where I think we're getting training incorrect in the, the physio, chiro, sports and conditioning world. I think that brace the core is a concept that needs to go, in my opinion.
I mean, brace the core is like the start of it. There's also a lot of functional trainers, quote unquote, and physiotherapists are basically becoming more and more fond of what's called anti-rotational training. So literally resisting or stabilizing your spine against rotation. Like they're deliberately training this pattern into their nervous system for quote unquote more safety and security within movement, right? But what are the effects of de-patterning your natural spinal rotation?
You won't be able to have natural spinal rotation is the issue there, right? You're literally training. So let's talk about anti-rotation training for a second, because it is the highest order of training, right? You do not go against this if you don't want trouble. Okay, so right now, anti-rotation is what you do if you're a really good sports and conditioning trainer. Okay, and I did it for the longest time because I just looked at it and said, oh, it makes sense, like, since we need to have stable cores in order to drive power out of the legs, okay, or out of the arms, if I have a stable structure in the middle, I'm going to be able to drive more power out of my limbs, okay? That's what I thought before, and that's what made sense in the context of sports training and training others. However, now, with the spinal engine, having recognized in watching so much slow motion and watching people walk, run, I cannot deny that the spine moves from side to side. And most of the time, people are training out of this. And in fact, if you do training, let's say you're an athlete and you've done sports and conditioning training, you've likely done anti-rotation training. So you've been trained out of your natural ability to move in the spinal engine. Very controversial topic. So it's an interesting one to explore, and I'm definitely open to debate for this. So
yeah, and so I do want to actually bring up another point that you made, where there is this idea that the more you can brace and the tighter you can get, the more tension you can produce, the more force you can put out, right? That's a basic powerlifting principle. If you want to lift more weight, gymnasts do this too with higher level gymnastics movements. They will brace their cores, squeeze their glutes as tight as they can. And it's this process called irradiation, right? Where they're generating more force through their limbs through total body tension. And that was, and by the same degree, I also thought that if I brace my core super fucking tight, and I'm squeezing my glutes actively while I sprint, that means that I'll be able to produce more force and more power output. And I did experience that, right? Like like my sprint time went down significantly by jacking my squat up over several years. That said, it's not a huge accomplishment for me because I was starting from like a pretty deconditioned, like honestly, any amount of athletic, anything would have made me a faster runner because I started, as like a fat 280-pound kid, and then like lost 100 pounds and like could squat 400 pounds, right? So any amount of like improvement in musculature was going to improve my sprint time. But what I'm saying is there is this idea that you can produce more force through more tension through the core. Do you think those two ideas could almost exist in harmony? Like where if you're timing the tension in your core during the rotation, like obviously the issue is too much tension through the core is going to stop rotation, which becomes inefficient movement and inefficient transference of force.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions that you've had there. Here's how it is.
Right.
How do I break this down? Basically, yeah, maybe you can get more rotation, but rotation isn't side bend. When you side bend and you rotate at the same time, it actually becomes more of a figure 8 pattern. So if I was to look at my shoulders, they would, instead of going just like this, I would be moving in a figure 8. So as I run, my shoulders go in an underhand figure 8 in the spinal engine like this, okay? So it looks like that. And because I'm going forward, you would see this motion. If I put neon lights on my shoulders and I was to take a long exposure photo, you would see a infinity pattern, okay? A wave. It's a wave going up and down. Now my pelvis will have an opposite wave. It's going to have a wave that goes overhand. So my pelvis is doing an overhand maneuver, my shoulders are doing an underhand maneuver, and my spine in the middle is rotating and waving to allow those two motions to happen. This is nowhere to be found in traditional strength training. Traditional strength training is like, no, that doesn't happen. Just keep it straight and let's go, right? So you can pack on a lot of muscle on your glutes and propel you forward, but are you going to be able to do it all day? Are you going to be able to stay injury-free? Can you just do it one time for 30 yards and then you got to pack it in? Like there's so much to it, right? So it's not just about getting the best time. It's about being an efficient, powerful mover that can repeat it. And I want to be sprinting when I'm 80. I'm not joking. So it's like, that's the context I'm looking at it in. And the brace the core model of tight spine, to me, when I look at it now and I see elderly people, it's like, now your spine is locked. It's going to be very hard for you to start waving it back and forth and getting that natural motion back. Where if I was to look at a kid, I'm like, kid, please don't lose that spinal engine because it's hard to get back, right? So that's the way I would look at it. Train kids to just allow the natural motions to happen and work with those elastic properties of the tissue as your spine waves back and forth.
And I mean, people who are having a hard time visualizing this, just go on YouTube and search baby crawling, right? And when you watch a baby crawl, you're seeing their hips not necessarily hike, but like they rotate in to reach forward with their knees. They're not just pulling their hip flexor up and pulling their knee forward. Their whole hip, their whole spine curves up to reach with that knee to get to the next part. Just watch the way a baby crawls and how they move their hips, how they transfer the force from leg to leg. It does follow that same spiral pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So I'm going to pull up, just give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up a video here and it's going to really show the differences between the classic theory of brace the core and the theory of spinal engine. Okay. So again, I'm going to reiterate that spinal engine says that the spine is actually driving most of the movement, okay, if not all of the movement. Debate about that, right? But let's say spine is driving most of the movement. The legs are just going along for the ride with the hips. Okay.
Which would mean you wouldn't even need the tightness of the core, right? You wouldn't need that extra force output because your legs aren't the driver of the movement. If the spine is the engine of the movement, you wouldn't even need that extra irradiated power.
Absolutely, right? Like we'll talk about the context of training in specifically afterwards, because I want to lay out this point that basically between the two models, only the spinal engine says that without legs, you would be able to move. So I'm going to pull up this screen here.
And for people who are listening on Spotify or iTunes, we do this on nofilter.net, which is an interactive platform. It allows us to share a screen in real time as we're talking. And we do pull up videos to kind of give visual explanations. So if you ever want to watch the video replay, it's in my vault in nofilter.net. And you can also watch the live streams on www.nofilter.net and ask us questions in real time. So we got the video pulled up now.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, right now they're talking about the classical approach. You see the top here, it's just a passenger unit. That's the vertebrae. And the bottom is your locomotor unit. That's your legs, right? But in this theory, you shouldn't be able to move. You shouldn't be able to propel yourself forward if you didn't have legs. Let's take a look at what happens here.
Carried away by the legs. Then we will formulate diagnosis by interpreting the signs and symptoms of an injured patient as manifestations of weaknesses in the column and design our rehabilitation procedures so as to reinforce the strength of that passive column. And it might then appear reasonable to reinforce the spinal column by fusing part of the spine and fixing plates or rods onto the vertebrae. But if the spine were in fact an engine, the primary engine for human locomotion, inherited from our fish ancestors, then we might have to review the interpretation of signs and symptoms leading to diagnosis and the corresponding protocol for the...
So what you're watching now is a person walking without legs or arms.
Yeah.
Now, there's going to be a major...
His spine is moving him.
Exactly. And you can see the spinal engine in a major way in this video. I would recommend really watching it. It's around 6:30 on Serge Grekovetsky's. We'll link it in the description. Serge Grekovetsky is the spinal engine, master. He was a PhD nuclear physicist who had back pain, right? But either way, he's showing the spinal engine right now, and everything that you're seeing on the spine is an exaggeration of what happens if somebody has legs as well, right? Because this person has no legs. He has to exaggerate each motion, so you'll really see the movement in his spine, right? Where a person with legs won't have as much motion in each part, but it'll all still be there.
The point that I found really, really interesting here too was that I just wanted to point it out too. He said the spine is an engine that we inherited from our fish ancestors, right? So we're really looking at this from a lens of what did we evolve to move like? And there is the theory that, the first land mammal was an adaptation of a marine mammal. And a marine mammal, you would just watch the fish. They move through the water by an undulation of their spine. And if we have a common ancestor back then yes, the evolutionary iterations of it would obviously change if we're bipedal mammals and bipedal primates. But the whole idea here is that we did evolve to create locomotion from a spinal undulation.
Yeah, I believe so, right? Like that video just showed the spine or the person moving through space forward, locomoting with no legs. This doesn't work with the old theory. The old theory says it's just going along for a ride. Okay, so I'd recommend viewing that. And if someone has an explanation for why that is, using the old theory of or the current theory of brace the core, having the spine as a passive column, I'd love to hear, right? But yeah, you were mentioning the fish ancestors and all that. Basically, if you look at almost any animal, they're going to have that sway. Most animals, if not all, but humans are quadrupeds, right? So you're going to see it wave like this back and forth. Watch your dog walk. you're not going to see him walking pin straight. You're going to see him wave a little bit. Okay. Watch it in slow motion from the side. It'll look like he's waving up and down if he runs, or he or she runs, right? And if you look at it from the front and back, it'll look like a diagonal wave, kind of like a fish. The human's wave is side to side because we're bipedal. Okay, so nature does have waves, and we can see them over and over and over and over again on slow-mo from many different athletes. The best athletes have the best, or the best movers, I should say, have the best sways. So, yeah, even in dancing, you know that a sway is better than both aesthetically and functionally. Swaying, having good motion rhythm from side to side is more important than staying nice and straight. We already know this in most contexts where it's not lifting. But for some reason, we got confused bringing lifting into everything else for rehab purposes. And that brings along stability of the spine without the back and forth wave.
And again, like if you're thinking from a joint by joint approach, like I think it was the first time I started thinking about this differently was when you introduced me to boxing, because boxing moved in different planes and you know, basically in order for any amount of force transference to happen when you're landing your punches, you need that snap, you need that rotation, you need to kind of ride those like parabolic curves of force to like snap your punch. And I was like, this is really interesting because I've never thought of it in terms of following a force curve to its logical conclusion, right? I was always thinking of like, how can I just contract my muscle to propel myself through space? It's never been about how efficiently can I transfer force from one part of my body to another, and what's the origin of that force transference, right? And in a lot of cases with boxing, it's that whip with the spine, right?
Yep. Yeah, you'll see it in the movement, right? You'll see most good athletes. I'm about to play a video of Mike Tyson shadow boxing, right? And in that world, in boxing, you rarely see fighters stay nice and upright and completely straight and only rotating. A lot of the times they're dipping side to side, right? So I'm going to play a video of Mike Tyson right now doing spinal engine maneuvers where he's moving his spine side to side in order to propel himself through space. Now, it's not exactly like running, but the parallels are all there. Okay, almost any movement you do is going to have a locomotion component to it. When I ski, I see locomotion now. When I'm, lifting, at that bottom part of the lift, when I have to come up out of the hole in squatting, which I don't do anymore, but when I did, you see the knees come in quickly. Like, why is that happening? That's part of the locomotion process, right? So in this example, in boxing, you're going to see Mike Tyson moving around, kind of like mentioned before, it almost looks like a fish because he's going from side to side. It looks like he's flopping over, but he's completely in control, right? So let's take a look at this. All right, here we go. Watch him move here.
You're not sharing your screen right now.
Oh, I'm not. Okay, so I'm going to bring that back here. Sorry about that.
That's all good.
Oh, okay. Missed clicking the extra button there. Okay, so now it's working.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Okay, so Mike Tyson speed. I'm gonna take the volume off for a second here, and I'm gonna run you through this. Okay, so it's in 1.25. I'll slow it down to normal here. But you'll see either way that Tyson is moving back and forth. Look at that spine. You can see through his jersey. He's just going back and forth, side to side. And now what he's doing there is he's harnessing the spinal engine. When he coils over to one direction, he's loading that spinal engine. So the side that's being loaded, he bends to one side. The side that he bends towards is going to be compressed. The other side is going to be stretched out. That's going to bring fascial tensions and compressions within your body. And he's using those compressions and tensions to propel himself the other direction or to propel a punch. So he's using the natural ability of the spinal engine to help him propel his punches forward in boxing or to propel his movement forward in boxing. So it's not just a running thing, it's a natural ability to do anything.
Well, it's sort of like, you know, if your joints are moving through a pretty fluid range of motion from your ankles, knees, and your hips, but then your spine is just rigid, you're creating a whip, but then like saying one part of the whip has to stay tight. And that doesn't work. You need the whole, like, that's basically you're stopping the force from transferring from where it originates at the foot, right? Like that pivoting, you're literally creating a dead spot in the chain of force transference.
Yes, I think, okay, you're not allowing natural rotations of your pelvis and your lower spine to happen, so that force has to go somewhere. It's going to be definitely going to be inefficient. It's not going to look as good, and it's not going to be as powerful, right? And it's going to, you know, lead you to wear and tear. Now, with the spinal engine, the basically it goes like this. The concept is an engineering concept from the early 1900s. Serge Gregovetsky said this about the spinal engine, and it's that if a rod has a curve in it, okay, which is analogous to our spine having a lumbar lordosis, a bend in the lumbar spine. If you side bend that rod that's already bent, then you'll get a rotation in both the top and the bottom of the actual rod.
Right.
Okay, so this is a property of a rod, which our spine is a rod. So when you side bend your spine, because it's already bent in the lower spine, you get a natural rotation, and it's a counter rotation of your shoulders and your hips. So they're going in opposite directions. In between, not coincidentally, is your obliques, which go in opposite directions. So it's like a wind-up toy going one way to the other way.
Yeah.
And that's free energy. If you stop that free energy from happening, you're going to stop the free energy from happening, right? So it's not a good thing. You can do it, and we see athletes all over the place right now trained out of it, okay? But a lot of people naturally keep this because this is a natural mechanism, okay? The properties of a rod, when bent, you side bend it, there's a natural rotation opposite in the top and the bottom of the rod. That is your pelvis and your shoulders. And in between, you have the soft tissues pulling and pushing in tensions, or I shouldn't say pulling and pushing, compressing and tensing, and then snapping back in the other direction. So if you can time out these twists in the pelvis and the shoulder with the landing of your foot and your side bend, you can propel your body to the other side using free energy from the elasticity of your tissues.
Right. And, you know, it's really interesting when you're thinking of it as like almost like a passing of the energy back and forth between the two sides of your body, without that sort of impact, right? There's a smooth transition. Like I mean, I used to say for the longest time that the reason I don't run is because I'm a 185 to 190 pound guy at any given time of the year, and that just landing alone is too much impact on my joints. Even if I'm doing like a lot of joint prep work, that's a lot of impact directly on my joints because I'm landing on my foot and I'm feeling this shockwave travel through my joints. This is saying that rather than absorbing the impact through my joints, the fact that I'm 195 pounds or 190 pounds is irrelevant because I'm able to transfer that force efficiently from side to side and give it a place to really like exit through my body as well, rather than sort of, vibrate and absorb into my joints as I'm landing. Right? We're transferring the force instead of landing the force.
I would say that if you do this correctly, you're recycling energy because everything's going in a spiral, a circle, and an infinity. So if I look at my xiphoid process, the bone in the middle here, and I'm running, it's going in an infinity sign, like a sideways 8, okay? And I'm using the harness of that motion to propel me forward, okay? It's a hard concept to see, but I'm going to link a whole bunch of spinal engine examples in my Instagram coming up because I really want to showcase what it looks like in reality. It looks beautiful, okay? It looks efficient. You could just see. I've shown it to a few people who are good runners, and they just know it intuitively. They're like, yeah, I want that. I don't know quite how to get it, but I want that, right? And I think it's just a better way to move. And if we're only talking straight line, getting from point A to point B fast, let's say a 40-yard dash, it's important, but it's not that important because you can just pack on a huge engine, take the most powerful guy and just get him to go straight for 40 yards. He may beat the guy who has the spinal engine, right? Mm-hmm. But within motions that have full 3 dimensions, you do not want to be the guy that's stiff in the upper body. You want to be harnessing the geometrical forces with your lower body and having them match to what they're doing. And they match every time with the spinal engine because it's designed that way. The rod bends and you're twisting in opposite directions up top, and pelvis and shoulders are twisting in the opposite directions, harnessing the soft tissue, and you're moving better.
So essentially, you know, when we're because this is like an episode to follow up on the essentials of human movement in terms of what is fundamental, right? And so the 2 movement patterns that we're talking about here, I think, are rotation and side bending, right? And they have to happen in conjunction. They follow patterns. And again, like if you're listening, it's harder to kind of see when we're doing the actual visual demonstrate. We're making these figure 8s with our chests, our collarbones, and everything, right? So we're talking about the ability to side bend and the ability to rotate. And when you are training in conventional, like if you're doing a deadlift, for example, you're not side bending. You're not bending over on your side unless you're doing some sort of weird, like old-time strongman style deadlift. But the conventional training says, get as rigid as possible through your spine, brace your core as tight as you can so that you can withstand, and don't allow a side, or, like if your spine twists or your spine bends to one side, you're fucked. You're screwed. You're on your way to Snap City, bro. And we're talking about retraining that, right? Because you lose it through that type of training.
Well, it is very true that you probably shouldn't side bend if you're doing a deadlift. Like you're going to hurt yourself. So within this context of safety, don't side bend during a deadlift. And that's, for the masses who don't practice this or don't understand it, you're much more safe just keeping your spine straight and neutral, and that's that, right? It's not optimal training, but in the context of fitness, how we see it now, weight loss and all that and burning calories, it's like, the safe zone is the neutral zone. You can't mess it up, or it's pretty hard to mess up, so just keep there. And even in chiropractic school, and I know physios learn this, and I know it was the thought of the time that you shouldn't even forward flex at all. You know what I mean? You shouldn't. The spine should always be dead neutral, and you should always try to keep it that way.
Yeah.
Now that's that type of advice where you're like, you have an injury, just rest for 2 weeks and you'll probably get better after 2 weeks. Is that the best way to do it? No. But is that going to keep you from injuring yourself again immediately? Probably yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that you said that too. I remember how revolutionary it seemed for some people who live their life by the lifting context when they were introduced to Jefferson curls, right? Like this pure spinal flexion movement that basically, you curve down, you curve your entire spine, and you're focusing on this joint segmentation in your spine. It was like this, whoa, man, like that's so counterintuitive, like it's so revolutionary to introduce it to these guys who are deadlifting, right? It's like, oh wow, like loaded spinal flexion, that's like the next thing, man. Like it was so like, wow.
That's still hot right now.
It's still, well, and that's what I mean. It's like this is a very recent thing where J curls are gaining a little bit of momentum. Probably from either like the ATG guys who are doing it, made it pretty popular. Who's that? FRC does
functional
too.
Range conditioning.
Yeah.
Olympic lifters use it. Power lifters use it.
I mean, it's been used in gymnastics for like forever, right? Like anyone
absolutely.
who does.
And there's nothing wrong with spinal segmentation. Like I teach people that as the easiest, lowest hanging fruit. It's like, can you separate your spine? It's more like, for me, it's an assessment. It's like, let's see how much this person has feeling of their body and how much they can separate the joints. Fine. Like I'll use it for that. But in the context of training it over and over and over again, I think it's more of like a party trick than something to be trained all the time. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a lifter, that might be a different story. Okay. I'm talking about training forward locomotion, training athletes who move fast, cut, run. Probably not something I do or put a lot of energy into. I
Right.
want the spine to move side to side. I want you landing your head over your foot as you step. That will get you the right math, the right geometry, or the right starting point for you to propel your body to the next step. If you have your head not in line with your foot, if it's off kilter, you're going to be off balance, period.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And again, like, to reiterate, we're working on a different map here, right? Because, and I hopefully by now you're kind of understanding why we're working on a different map. The two main differences that I've noticed in these conversations so far is we kind of shifted from, like, if you're thinking about how you walk, the heel to toe straight line model has been replaced by the idea of a pivotal system within your foot, and not just within your foot, but along the whole chain of your body. That we're moving away from the brace, the core model, and the stable spine structure model into the spinal engine model. And certain people talk about this and acknowledge it. Like you said, there's some guys that are giving it funny alternate names, like the pendulum core theory or the core pendulum theory. And basically, we're switching from sort of a linear boxy view of the human body. And I say boxy because you think of the sagittal plane and the way that people lift. This is how I thought. That's how movement felt to me, was like I'd squat up and down, I would press up and down, I would pull up and down, front and back. It was up, down, front, back. That was it, right?
And you became really good at those, right?
Totally. Yeah,
And
I got
very
really good at
efficient moving up and down in a straight line. Your body adapts to what you do. So if you adapt straight, rigid motion, you will see straight, rigid motion, and you will, like, when I watch people now in this lens, I see really boxy, linear, stuck motion. Okay, not a wave of your spine, not able to move quickly. If you turn, it's in one, whole body type maneuver. There's no intricacies of the spine happening during the motion, during quick motions. That's what I'm trying to get to. I'm trying to have my spine disassociated so I can be more like rubber, use the elasticity of my tissues to get me, spinning in another direction versus a boxy maneuver, right? If I looked at myself, because I came from a powerlifting, CrossFit background, bodybuilding, these are all stable types of exercise. When I watched myself box during this time, my body was super boxy. Like I was rotating really hard from my whole body trying to punch. Like, and I boxed for a long, long time, so it's pretty good. But I noticed the difference. Like I had no nuances to my spinal motion. It was either one direction or the other in a box. And with the punches came a lot of rotation. There wasn't that snap through the spine. I couldn't choose the exact angle I wanted to go in because I was too rigid, because I was keeping the spine rigid, because I was taught that you should stabilize. That's just not the case in my mind anymore. And the fruits of the movement will show you. If you watch how I move, it's not boxy. It's always fluid.
Yeah. And again, like, the emphasis is now on how efficiently can you transfer force, not necessarily how stable are your joints, how fluid, elastic, how resilient. I mean, you still need stability. But maybe a better word would be tissue. I was going to say maybe a better word would be tissue resiliency, right? You still need.
Oh yeah.
You still need, training, doing things like tendonal training or even muscular training is not a bad thing. But you were the first person who even introduced me to the idea of training tissue elasticity, right? So you have some movements where you do a swing behind you and you're training the elasticity of your pectoral muscle. So you have that snap on the throwing movement. Another thing is, like, your side bending needs to be elastic. So, if you're thinking it's like, oh, no problem, I'll fix my spinal engine, I'll just stretch I'll do some lateral bending stretches, then you're not necessarily training that elasticity or the movement component of it. You need to be able to, like, when you were showing Mike Tyson there, it's that load and the snap. It's the elastic recoil that you're training in that side bending and rotation. It's not just, don't just stretch out your spine and start curving your spine in a static stretch, essentially, when you're doing this.
Yeah, like it could be, static stretching for me still has its place in that I like to, side bend every once in a while and really feel out the end ranges of my muscle, but it's not something I concentrate on a lot, right? It's just basically like cat stretching, getting way out there and feeling the elasticity of my muscles, right? So that's the case there. But you could learn the positions doing a static side bend. That's fine off the get-go, but it does have to eventually lead to an elastic motion side to side. That is propelled by your lats, your obliques, and the fact that you've landed head over foot and you have momentum with the arm coming down to go to the other side. So it ends up looking a little bit like this. Can you see my screen?
Yeah,
it ends up looking a little bit like that versus just a straight. This would be brace the core. This is spinal engine. Okay.
Right. And again,
so,
it's almost like the differentiation. You're trying to produce the force with when your spine is straight, driving with your legs, and you're pumping with your arms, and you're assuming that's where the force and the forward movement comes from. When you versus with the spine is like the rotation and the side bending almost creates a whip that propels you forward, eh?
Yeah, that's part of it, right? There has to be components of the spinal engine. Again, side bend your spine, okay? And that's not an active side bend once you get it. Your body will just automatically do it. And if you were to jog super, super slowly, you're going to automatically go head over foot because your body is trying to be in balance. So it's not a question of whether you're going to do it in a slow sense. You almost can't brace the core when you're going. It's when you're going fast, you can get everything tense and just move your legs really fast. And basically to me, when I see that now, it's like catching yourself out of balance at every step. Okay, so no matter what, you're going to be doing the head over foot when you're going slow to a high degree. Whether you keep that when you're going fast, that's going to depend on your training, your nervous system. A lot of times, for myself as an example, when I was a kid and I wanted to run, I would just make my body really tense, get my nervous system cranked up in my own head and go. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think I was using that elasticity or was never taught to do that. It looked like really rigid running. And I wish I would have had someone to tell me, no, just relax and let your body go. You may have to give a little bit at first, but once you learn it, you're going to be able to spin, pivot. So basically you're going to have a lot more options for every single step because with every step, your head is over on top of your foot, you're in balance, you now have an option. If your head is not over your foot, if your spine is rigid, you do not have an option for your movement. You have to get in balance first, which is a split second, then move. I want to be in balance right when the point of my foot contacts the ground so I can do my next maneuver. A good example of that is in boxing. If I'm moving in a rhythmic fashion, like back and forth, in boxing, can you see my screen?
Yep.
How I move back and forth like this. A lot of boxers will have a rhythm, right? So here, when I'm in the back, when I'm leaning toward the back, now I'm on my back leg. When I lean towards the front, I'm in my front leg. If I have that rhythm back and forth, I can now get to my front leg. I know my head is over that foot. Now I have a maneuver. I can either throw punch power or I can move quickly, right? So in order for me to do a maneuver in boxing, in running, if I wanted to cut, my head has to be over a foot, either foot, and then I can do my cutting motion. I have options off that. Okay, so it's not only more efficient in the elasticity properties, but it's more efficient in the fact that you're just landing your head over your foot and you're ready to go.
Right. So if someone wanted to start regain, and again, like what you just said, it's like it'll be easier when you're walking, but when you start running and you start applying it to more explosive or fast or patterns that require more coordination, that's when you start to lose it and you kind of realize how far coded in the other sort of rigid structure you've become, right? And I know that's true for me. I'll actually record myself running in slow motion to see at what speed do I start to lose my efficient patterning or the propulsion with my spine. What point do I start trying to make my spine a rigid structure or what point do I start losing the rotation in my feet, or what point do I start caving in a little bit, right? So if someone wanted to start doing something to regain their spinal engine, essentially, how would someone start recoding that behavior?
Okay, first off, look at my Instagram to see a visual representation of what the spinal engine should look like. Second, crawling or crawling patterns are actually spinal engine. You have to move your spine from side to side to crawl properly. Okay?
Right.
So if you were to look up crawling patterns, I know Goda has a lot on this. Goda Movement, I would look at their page. They have a lot of crawling. That's a good place to start because you will get your spinal engine back the more you move your spine from side to side. But my personal favorite thing to do is roping, okay? So having a rope, not necessarily jumping rope, but putting the rope next to you in a figure 8, okay? So this is becoming very popular. I don't know if people realize why, but it's instilling the spinal engine in you. I'm doing a figure 8 pattern with my hands and my body as I stand in the same spot with the rope, and the rope dictates how efficient and how smooth I am. It'll show me in front of me how smooth I am. Okay? So that's where I would start with most people. Letting your upper body relax and roping. You can check that out on my Instagram as well. Or, I mean, there's a lot of YouTube on this right now.
Yeah. And I mean, you just, again, introduced me to roping maybe 5 days ago or less. And I've been obsessed with it. I did it about like for 20 minutes before jumping on this podcast. And what I noticed is, like you said, is you're starting to ingrain these patterns in your nervous system as well. You're rotating your spine. And when I was walking and I was paying attention to all those cues of, outside edge of the foot, head over foot, good pivot facing the knee in line with the sort of xiphoid process, all those cues, I noticed that figure 8 pattern naturally occurring, and it became sort of more of a natural thing. I remember when you start doing this work, at least when I started doing this work, maybe you have a similar experience, it would be, you would get one thing and then realize that you're missing the next piece of the puzzle. So for me, that head over foot thing was something that I didn't quite have yet, even though my rotation was pretty good. When I started adding that in, now I forget a lot less. It's more ingrained in my day-to-day stride now.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people get addicted to the rope when they first do it. Okay, because it's that natural motion, you're starting to get it back, and it's a very easy way to do it. I introduced my father to it, and he's in his 70s, right? And it's something that anybody can do. Put in that base athletic pattern. That's what I look at it as. You're teaching your brain that base athletic pattern, moving back and forth, and that's something I can always go back to. In the morning, I'll do 5 minutes, just real nice, real slow, getting that pattern in me ready for the day. And that leads me to another point there. I love tangents, is that that's the way I train now, is that I will train into the pattern of spinal engine and what I told you before with the checklist, head over foot and all that. But basically what I do is I code the proper motions all day in a slow way. If I'm feeling good, I progress more and more and more. And I'll push it if I feel real good. Let's say by the end of the day, I'll be pushing things that I, couldn't do at the start of the day in fear of, injury or whatnot. But at the end of the day, I feel ready to roll. It's good to go. And that's basically the way I train now. I go by feel, but I'm coding within the math, within all the checklists that I mentioned last time. Head over foot, I'm going to go over it again because I want to get really annoying with just hammering this in. Outside edge of the foot, rolling in a pivot point, okay? 2, inside ankle bone high. 3, knee is pointing away from the body 20 degrees. 4, you're in your back chain at the hip. Your butt is behind your rib cage. And ideally it's, on the next level of it, it's turning a corner, okay? We'll get into that after. I'm side bent at the spine. My head is over my foot at landing. And ideally, both my hands are coming down at that landing too to propel me to the next step, which is the other side. Repeat the process.
And that's how you walk. And guys, like, it's funny because like we're talking about literally walking here. We're talking just about becoming efficient or learning how to walk again properly. It doesn't take a genius to realize.
That checklist is the same thing for a full sprint, a cut, anything there as well. Going from walking to full sprint and cutting, that same checklist applies.
So this is universal human biomechanics, ultimately.
Yes, I would say so.
And this is 101. If you don't understand how the human being moves and why it moves that way, then your training and your movement practice is going to be, not beneficial to you, because you're going to be coding in the wrong patterns. And I remember thinking about the nervous system a lot when I was powerlifting, where it was like I was trying to code my ability to stay rigid. I was trying to code the ability to stay tight and more effective and more efficient. The issue behind doing that over and over is that you're practicing a nervous system state. You're practicing a sort of mode of being as you're moving. And
absolutely, I agree.
Yeah, and so doing things like I'm sure you can see my screen right now where I'm sharing some of the slow-mo of just the way that I'm rotating and side bending a little bit with the rope here. Like, I'm trying to code that back into my system. You can see how much I get. Like, I'm really making it dramatic just so that I can feel it as I'm going. And that's like this is a new movement pattern for me. I have not thought about rotating or side bending other than maybe a couple of yoga classes that I was doing. And yoga does not do this in the context of human locomotion. They do it in the context of stretching for the sake of stretching your tissues and creating a meditation from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're seeing right now with the roping, you're doing a very good job. You've been doing this for under a week, right? But if you go back to where you can see your hands, they're making a figure 8 pattern. It's an 8 sideways, okay? The infinity sign. And my whole body is kind of doing a version of that, right? Whether I want to go overhand or underhand, it's an infinity pattern. And that is the pattern. Like, you're trying to instill the pattern of running if you're going underhand, and throwing when you're going overhand, okay? You can adapt this to many sports, but your overhand motions right now, that is the throwing pattern, or striking or whatnot. And when you're going under there, it is the running pattern in the most basic way, right? But if you look at your hands right now, I would say they need to be closer together so that when you come up, you want to be nice and smooth. Like, the rope will show you in real time that if you're smooth, the rope will look smooth. If your body is, let's say you lean to the right when you're roping and you're not smooth with let's say one part of the underhand motion, your rope will show you right away. So it's instant feedback for smooth motion. And the secret really is the infinity patterns, the spirals, the cornering, the motions of moving your body in a circular fashion will allow you to recycle the energy and continue the motions. The linear model where you're abruptly stopping, you're very energy inefficient when you're doing this. So again, the rope is a great way to instill these patterns within you. I'll be back in 1 second. Just if you want to go over what you're seeing here, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, of course. So I mean, like, the rope, the thing that I've kind of noticed is prior, I would use a training implement for the express purpose of fatiguing muscles or for creating force within my body. Now, what I'm using the rope for, I'm not using a super heavy rope so that my muscles are fatiguing and I'm training this pattern to get stronger and have force output. I'm using the rope as a kinesthetic feedback mechanism to see how efficiently I'm moving through this particular parabola or this force curve. I'm trying to get a better sense of where's the transference of my feet, especially on these turnarounds where I'm pivoting. How smooth can I pivot and have the rope stay straight or stay smooth? right? So that transference, like you can kind of see the pivot on the outside edge of my foot as I transfer from the overhand to the or the underhand to the overhand.
This is very good stuff for 1 week, right? But I've been doing this for 2 years, and I still code the most simple things possible, and that is just the smooth underhand figure eight, smooth overhand figure eight, and when you get it smooth with a heavier rope, it's a great feeling. It's like, okay, this is so natural, and you can immediately apply it into motion right after. If I rope for 5 minutes, in code, meaning I'm back chain dominant, I'm on the outside edges of my feet, all the checklists that I'm going over and over with, okay? When I do that for 5 minutes, I go run, I feel way better, way more smooth. But I have, like, the one mistake I did for people who are getting into roping is I was trying to do too many fancy maneuvers too quick. I wasn't getting into more getting the footwork down, which is what you're doing. That's great. I was doing a lot of maneuvers that I would, if I was just looking at my feet, would be questionable because I was concentrating too much on the fancy maneuvers up top. If you just use the rope as a way to code athleticism, you will get a lot of fruit out of it.
And I mean, I like, so just for example, I felt the rope go here when I came up, and I was like, okay, cool. Like I'm like, you see how it kind of flops as it comes down? Like, okay, like my figure eight is gone. So I tried to reestablish that figure eight and then get smoother in the movement, right? And this is, again, this is not an implement to just fatigue your muscles or train, force by going as hard as you can on the rope or sweating. This is a kinesthetic feedback mechanism to see how efficient at these patterns are you. And I'm doing really basic pattern here. I'm training my spinal engine. I'm trying to, it's funny because I when I looked back at this video, when I stepped down on that front foot, my inside ankle bone collapses. So I'm like, okay, cool. This is why I do this stuff. Is like, where do I start to lose some of the fundamentals of the structure that's going to keep me stable or keep me, one more thing where you're talking about just doing basic patterns, like get a figure eight first before you even take a step forward. Like I only just started moving forward in space with the rope after trying to get my figure eight down and be a little bit smoother with the rope. Now that I'm
moving
a little bit
is hard with the rope in a proper motion. It's much harder than you'd think to link it all together without dumping energy. I would start just static in good bow position. I would start in bow position and rope from there.
Yeah, because if you're bowed, and like a standing bow could just be, feet barely at hip distance, still on the outside edge of your foot, still inside ankle bone high, and then just come down slightly, forward, lean shoulders past your hips in that back chain dominant position. And then as you're swinging, you'll notice that bow naturally kind of unloads that energy as you swing from side to side you'll start to feel, you get a very, very good sense of what spinal engine means. And I recommend people do this because spinal engine is one of those things that like you can hear people talk about, and then you can see, like, I think the video that you sent of the one guy who didn't have arms or legs, moving himself just by rotating the spine in a certain way, like that's super visual and that's really helpful. But until you feel it, you don't really understand what the spinal engine means. Like it has a different reality to it when you just try to embody it. And one of the things that I've noticed about these movement practices, these movement principles, is that when you do them, even if it is like a little bit hard to code them in, once you do them, it feels like what your body is supposed to be doing. It feels like, oh yeah, of course, this is just the way my body was designed to move. And I think it's anecdotal, and it's not, it's not based on, the research papers or that, but like the experience of moving in this way and how good you feel is proof of concept for me personally. I've always tried to test or apply on myself anything that theoretically sounded right.
Well, the thing is, spinal engine does have a full theory. It's made by a brilliant scientist. he was in pain. He was a nuclear physicist, right? This guy, he's not a nobody, right? And he's using
Right.
science principles from engineering. The strength and conditioning world and the rehab world just hasn't picked it up yet. They're working from a different model. So it's not like this model is out of nowhere. It's one observed in reality a lot, okay? Good athletes are doing it, even though they've been coded out of it, okay, with the opposite theory. And yeah, it's just like you'll see it everywhere. So it's hard to deny. It's there in theory and it's there in reality. So it's funny that you mentioned that because I don't know if you've seen it. A lot of people have seen this. It's Michael Johnson explaining Usain Bolt's run. And Usain Bolt, you haven't seen it?
No.
Okay, that's interesting because I'm going to play a little bit for you here where Michael Johnson describes Usain Bolt's movement, okay? And the thing with that is Michael Johnson comes from the camp of where everyone else comes from with running. It's that to keep your body nice and rigid. You will be fastest if you're quiet within the upper body and you just let your legs rip, okay? So Usain Bolt does it differently. He does that side bend, okay? That side-to-side action. Now, when I was in school, I noticed this, and people were like, no, it's because he has a scoliosis, okay? And I'm like, okay, it's because he has a scoliosis, right? And I didn't really question it at the time. I went with the dogma. It was a scoliosis. But now that I look back, I'm like, no, he's using spinal engine, right? So I'm just going to try to play this here. Give me one second. Okay. Whoop.
Why he can't.
Yeah, I'm having trouble with the screen sharing thing, of course. Oh, you know what? I'm forgetting to click the extra button there. That's what's up. Okay, so
one button away.
Yeah, one button away. There you go. Okay, so can you see it now?
Not yet. Yep, there it is.
Okay, so I'm gonna play this here, and this will be Michael Johnson explaining away the spinal engine on Usain Bolt. Usain is doing it wrong.
Can't use his experience to help him get through the rounds.
Pointing, to say the least. Let's have a little look at Usain Bolt, and we've got an angle that you particularly want to look at, which is him head on. What did you learn from this?
Yeah, so if you take a look here at Usain Bolt in this race, and this is something that we see often with him, he doesn't have lateral stability. So you will see.
About that.
What?
Oh.
And so now
That's
we
crazy.
know that.
Sorry about that.
So now wasted motion, all of that forth, and pay particular attention here to the shoulders. And there's a lot of wasted motion. All of that energy that should be going into the track is spilling out. And so now we know that he does have, I learned this when I visited him in Jamaica and did a documentary on him for BBC years ago, that he has slight scoliosis in his back. But it's a real issue for him with all of that energy going side to side, where if you take a look at the comparison over here with Justin Gatlin on the left side of your screen, very solid lateral stability, shoulders straight, and all of that energy then is going into the track and putting him in the right direction and allowing him to take the power that.
Okay, so
this is a perfect example.
It is literally the perfect example because you see the difference in the thought process there, where Usain's doing it wrong. He is dumping energy from side to side, but they've never been shown the spinal engine. And when you're running, when you're doing any training, 99% of trainers will get you to do lateral stability training or anti-rotation. Either way, it's stability, stability, stability. You must be stable because your spine is a passive column. This is what Michael Johnson thinks. That's probably what Usain Bolt also thinks, but his body has something different to tell him. He wants to go fast. He's getting in his natural motions and he's ripping. Okay, I personally think that he would be a lot faster if he was to use the spinal engine and just let his body roll from side to side. He's probably training out of it.
Yeah, and I love that we had that. And again, guys, if you're listening to this on Spotify, go to nofilter.net and watch the replay. Just scroll closer to the end and watch that. Or, what was the name of that video? Watch the video on YouTube, because it is a perfect example of seeing that figure 8 pattern in the upper body as he runs forward. And I mean, Usain Bolt, fastest man to run that sprint, is utilizing the spinal engine, while the other person who is being used as the example of the quote correct way is running slower than him. So go watch that video. What's it called? It was Michael Johnson.
That is Michael Johnson analyzes Usain Bolt's running. That will get you the video there. The point to that really was that, some runners will be more stiff in the upper body, but if you even looked at Justin Gatlin there, the other person in the video, if you would have just looked at him, he was also going side to side. So it doesn't matter, especially off the get-go in running, you're going to go side to side. It's just a question of how much. Are you allowing it to happen, or are you bracing yourself out of it, right? So that's really the question. I'm saying, let's harness this energy. Let's work with it. So the new stability to me is moving at the right time, okay? Or landing in the right positions at the right time, having everything in synchronicity versus just holding yourself tense.
So guys, this is the spinal engine theory. There's a lot of really interesting information on it, and this is probably, hopefully, a bit of a paradigm shift away from the way that you've maybe learned about lifting or learned about core stability or learned about just like human movement in general. Again, the paradigm that we're shifting from is the idea that the spine is a passive column that's being taken along for a ride by the primary drivers, which are the legs. That's the current model, or the more popular model. The model that we're suggesting is more correct in basic movement is the spinal engine theory, the idea that movement originates and is propelled forward by movements of the spine, both from lateral bending and from rotation in a figure eight pattern, opposite figure eight patterns happening from within the hips and the shoulders, so the pelvis and the shoulder girdle there. So this is episode 3 of the Art of Move podcast, and what we're aiming to do again is not necessarily ruffle feathers or say that one person is right, one person is wrong. We're just investigating truth of human movement and trying to figure out the best way to do this. That's ultimately why we're here. That's why we're having these conversations. If you guys ever have any questions, feel free to come onto one of these live recordings of the podcast. We do 1 or 2 per week live on No Filter Network, which is an interactive platform. You can come on, ask us questions in the chat, knock, and see if you want to join on yourself. Will, if people wanted to start learning more about the spinal engine, they can obviously go to your Instagram at The Art of Move, or they can look up The Art of Move on YouTube as well. But if people wanted to start learning more about it as a theory, or where should they start in terms of their own movement?
There's not a lot on the spinal engine, okay? Because again, the predominant theory is the rigid core, right? Mm-hmm. Serge Gregovetsky, if you're a layperson and don't really care about the deep theory, you're probably not here in the first place. But if you want practical application of movement, start with the roping. Start with watching videotape of fast runners that are moving from side to side. Michael Jordan, Bo Jackson, Deion Sanders, Usain Bolt, they're all over the place, okay? People that are moving well side to side and are super athletic. Observe, okay? The roping, I would say in practicality, is the easiest way to start. Figure eights with an 8.5-foot rope, okay? And you can get those off many different places. Octo Moves, Tim Sheaf, if you type that in, he has ropes.
You can go to a hardware store and buy twine if you need to. I mean,
that's what I do, right? Like
is cut from a twine. You can just literally have an 8-foot rope that you cut and burn the ends off, or we taped mine, and it works perfectly. I was doing it for 20 minutes today, and it just felt amazing. So, guys, this is the Art of Move podcast, episode number 3. Come subscribe to us on nofilter.net. Feel free to hit that subscribe button if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify. Every episode, we're planning on bringing different concepts on here, but we also welcome debates. We welcome questions. We welcome the things that we're talking about. We never want to just assume that they are correct. If you have a piece of information that disproves anything that we're talking about or challenges anything that we're talking about, we want to hear it. We're not here to just say, the current model is wrong, although we might imply that quite a bit, that the current model is at least missing a lot of fundamental and important pieces when it comes to human movement. But subscribe to us and then interact with us. Leave us questions, leave us comments, leave us reviews. We want to engage you as much as possible. So my name is Anthony Manuel. I was here with Dr. William Raybar, and this is the Art of Move podcast. We'll see you next time, and go to nofilter.net if you want to be a part of the next show.
Awesome. Have a good one, guys.